The end of this parliamentary sitting likely quickened the pulse of members of Parliament as they get out of Ottawa for the rest of the summer. And in the week that the House rose, the Prime Minister sat down in this studio for an exclusive interview before hitting the road for some summer campaigning, including a must-win by-election on Monday. The week ended, though, with a key development in an explosive story about foreign interference that cast some big doubts on the journalism behind a jaw-dropping headline. Let's bring in our party insiders. Greg McEachern is a former Liberal ministerial staffer. Melanie Richer is a former Director of Communications for the federal NDP. And Fred Delory is a former national campaign manager for the Conservative Party. Happy Friday, gang. Good to see you all. Friday. Good to see you all here. Greg, let's start with you. A lot to talk about today, but I want to start with this latest revelation in the foreign interference allegations against Han Dong. Not a full vindication, but the big allegation against him, real doubt cast on up by a judge here in Ontario.
Yeah, I spent the last day or so just looking at some of the media coverage since last year. Huge number of columns and reporting. You know, there were news organizations that chose not to follow what the reporter did in this, but then did report what he reported. There were a lot of columns that were based on this, and it really is baked into, I think, the Canadian, if you're paying attention to this, the Canadian collective understanding of what's gone on here. And there's a lot here. There's a lot to be improved. This doesn't mean that foreign interference is not a real thing. But as somebody who always wanted to work in and around journalism, political communications, I've been at this for a long time, and I've been that person in rooms with caucuses, with cabinet ministers, defending reporters. A friend of mine, talks about a time where pointing to an article and saying to the cabinet minister, tell me what's wrong here. Tell me what you didn't say, because you're on the record and there's a tape on this. We've done that. But on this one, I have to say personally, there's something that felt off with it from the very beginning. And when you read the legal document, it's pretty horrendous there's a lot of questions about checks and balances here. Right. And at a time when I heard one of your panelists on the media panel talk about lack of faith or confidence in institutions like elections. Well, it's also in media as well. The reporter here, I think, has done a lot of damage. The news organization has. And I don't think we should do the Canadian thing where we just move on. I think your industry, frankly, has to have a bit of a conversation. You had Chris Waddell on earlier. I think if our viewers right now miss that, they should watch it. I've noticed some other reporters that have moved into universities talking about this, that it is time to have a conversation. Because you also have a lot of pressures. There's less resources. Is that part of it? Well, then let's make that part of the conversation.
So Melanie, this judgment is part of a process leading to a defamation suit. It seems is now the green light for the defamation suit. It's not the final word on it. It doesn't fully clear the concerns about the nomination of Don Valley North. Those appear to have some foundation, certainly based on everything we've seen and all of the processes looking into this. But on this initial story that Han Dong urged the Consul General to hold on to the Michaels to help the Conservatives, which never made a lot of sense to political operatives, there's a lot of doubt cast on that in this particular judgment.
Totally, and the allegation itself is so, to your point, it didn't really make sense, but is so damaging, is so, how can a Canadian advocate against the release of other Canadians? And the fact that that was written and that, appears to not be true is heartbreaking, really. Heartbreaking for those two Michaels, but also heartbreaking for the MP and his family, because I'm sure that is just, what an allegation to be made about you is in the news for everybody to see. I don't think that that's what anybody wants out of that. So the fact that to your point, Greg, the checks and balances, and it's funny that you say, when you first saw the story, you kind of stopped and went, wait a sec, let's take a look at this, because we thought the same thing. I think I was still on the Hill when this came out, and we thought the same thing of, okay, before we bring this up, before the NDP brings this up, let's make sure, absolutely sure that this is true, and to see that it's not is, to your point, when there is doubt out there, I think, and maybe not a fair thing to say, but to triple check, I think is super important, and I think we're going to see more of that as the story kind of plays out.
Fred, Greg said not everyone followed it, but we all kind of did, because we all kind of had to at a certain point, right? Because it was every day in question period. Mr. Dong stepped out of caucus, and it became an impossible thing to ignore, even if you couldn't independently verify it. It was out there in a credible national news organization. Where do you think this leaves us in terms of like how this has been covered, how well we understand it, you know, and especially linking it to the most recent stuff with NSI Cop of let's name names based on intelligence and like where are we on this?
We're right where we were at the beginning, nowhere.
Nowhere.
It's a complete mess. They weren't just allegations, they were explosive allegations. To say that a sitting member of parliament went out and advocated to another country to keep 2 political prisoners in prison to help an election, which made no sense. I was the national campaign manager for the Conservative Party in the last election, and when I saw the story, it just blew my mind at how ludicrous it was. It makes no sense. There's no way an MP or anyone would do that, to think that there's, for one, any political benefit, just from that perspective. So the whole thing was ludicrous. But to Greg's point, it got so much ink. There was so much coverage on this. And it was written where, you know, I saw people, they take it as truth. They trust the media. And that's one of the issues media has. And it's one of the struggles we have when we have people out there pushing about fake news, you know, when you're covering this type of story. And to show, you know, this the affidavit, like what the judge wrote, is that there's no evidence at all on any of this. So it's very problematic.
Yeah, Greg, it reads to me, I you know, segments of this are flying all around social media. There's a message in there, it seems to me, to global news: retract and settle. That is the reading you take from this. That people I've talked to, I've had defamation notices served against me in my career, never been successfully sued. But you read a decision like this, you know, sort of cutting apart the factual basis of the initial reporting. You know, Sam Cooper is not talking today, wouldn't come on the show. We invited him, you know, and I understand he's being sued, right? He's part of this, he's probably not allowed. But it's going to be a tough one for Global to handle, it seems.
Absolutely, it will be. Also, you know, I want to be very careful about what I say, but the reporter left that news organization not long after that, and so at that.
That happens a lot, though, in the business, right?
Exactly,
like,
right.
and people have left the CBC while lawsuits were still being resolved because of life circumstances and career changes.
But it's hard not to look at that departure differently now when you see facts like the reporter did not keep their notes, that they did not have anything that mentioned the MP's name. At one point, I've been on the receiving end working for politicians where you get a call like this and, you know, time stops and you devote all your energy to this. Well, it sounded from your previous interview with Chris Waddell that this was done very, very quickly and there wasn't a lot of time for that. I get it. It's a tough time. You've got to make money in this industry somehow, and it's on digital subscriptions, it's on eyeballs, it's on clicks. But if that actually ends up costing you more money, as well as your reputation, maybe it's time to take a deep breath.
Yeah, and look, we'll see where this goes. This will almost certainly head to a defamation suit unless Global does a retraction and an apology, which is what Mr. Dong and his lawyer Mark Pauly are asking for, and we'll see where that goes next. One thing we do know where it goes next is on the road, Mel, because Parliament has risen for the summer, and they're all getting out of town, and there's a big by-election on Monday. What's your sense of where things are right now with the House breaking for a few months?
Yeah, thank goodness everybody's going back to the riding, cooling their jets for a little bit, probably not, and talking to real people instead of each other, which is probably a good thing. What is interesting, at least I thought to myself, is almost like it's the end of a session, you know, we're a year away from an election, but it still kind of felt like more of the same, which I don't think is what any party really is hoping for. Obviously, they're going back to the ridings. We're going to see them do the Saint-Jean circuit in Quebec on Monday. We're going to see them do the Canada Day circuit as well. And this is kind of the events where you're seeing the barbecues. They're talking to real people and talking about the things that they did on the Hill in the last year. What I found interesting in particular, and we're going to talk about this a little bit later, the Prime Minister's interview on Monday, but the messaging that at least we saw from the Liberals this week was just like a little bit more of, you know, look how great we are. And I think that continued into, you know, the end of session with the by-election happening on Monday in Toronto St. Paul's, which is, you know, setting up to be a big one for the Liberals and the Prime Minister in particular. It'll be interesting to see how, you know, this messaging has been playing out, but also just this end of session, what comes next when we don't really know what comes next, and how that plays out in Toronto on Monday. For the Liberals in particular.
Yeah, Saint Jean Baptiste, or as we call it back home, St. John's Day. It's the same thing. Fred, your sense of where they are and the importance of Monday, which, by the way, we're going to have special coverage of. The three of you will be back here with me in studio on Monday night. What's your sense of where things are as the House breaks?
Well, look, I think it's interesting. It breaks, and we're going right into a huge test, which is a by-election. And I'm one of the few people that really point out that by-elections are incredibly important. They're real snapshots.
People keep telling me they don't matter, Fred. You're the only one. That and the fall economic statement.
Polls are interesting, but people actually have to get off the couch, go into a ballot box, and mark an X for someone. And you could really see what's going to be driving people. And I think this is one of those cases here where this is a downtown Toronto seat that should be one of the safest Liberal seats in the country. We lost by over 25 points in the last election. So if there's any way the Conservatives are even within 10 points, something's really shifting, and people are actually, I think, making a move here, and we're going to see continue. Look, if the Liberals lose this, I don't see how Trudeau stays on. We're already seeing different articles pop up of members of Parliament questioning, some actually putting their names to it for the first time, actually saying maybe you should, if he loses, I think the floodgates will open. If it's within 10 points, there'll, maybe there'll be some Liberal spin on this, but I think it'll be tough to keep this all contained.
Well, speaking of Liberal spin, Greg, I was speaking with a Liberal MP about this week, and they said if we're below the 8-point margin that they won the seat in 2011 when Michael Ignatieff was the leader, then look out. Does that tells you that we're below where we were at our low point, to use their words, and what that means for the ridings all around Toronto, St. Paul's, the spiral effect? That could be interesting. What's your sense?
Well, you've set me up for success here because you predicted I'm going to spin. So, it's really tough, to compare to Ignatieff because we had two, that was the second of two really bad elections, historic lows.
Yeah.
I think what Liberals are more mindful of, maybe two generations of Liberals, is the Martin Chrétien infighting. And what ultimately resulted was those two very poor election showings. I think people are allergic in the Liberal Party, those of us of a certain generation.
The hyphenated Liberals again?
Yeah, because it didn't really get us anywhere in the end. And I think people are very cautious about that. There's nobody standing in the wings, some columnists notwithstanding, that is going to jump in. And I think people are very mindful of that. Justin Trudeau is considered to be the person who rebuilt the party. Great polls in 2014, but going into 2015, not so great. He's really good at elections. They threw everything they could at him, and they have ever since. So I don't know if there'll be the haste. And again, we're talking in hypotheticals. But I think when people are thinking about this and the reluctance why we don't see somebody out there is that Liberals remember that time following 2006. It wasn't really a great time.
So Fred, this by-election in particular in St. Paul's would be a test for motivation for the Liberals and for the Conservatives, depending on how this goes, because that's who this race seems to be, but also messaging, right? And this is something you wanted to talk about for the Prime Minister and the challenges you've said and continue to see them having as they try to get that fourth win. Yeah,
and first of all, just to Greg's point about how there's no one waiting in the wings, it's true, all the other Liberal contenders are duds, I agree. There's no one there that could step up. To the current issue we have in front of you'll have your moment. Yes. To the current issue, there's an interesting article that Tanya Charles wrote in the Toronto Star this week where she quoted David Axelrod, who was in Toronto, who really laid out how incumbents struggle with messaging and how Biden is struggling, where he's focused on attacking Trump on democracy seems to be his narrative and his message. It doesn't move votes. It doesn't get anywhere. But at least Biden actually has a message. He's trying something. Where Trudeau is really grasping here, or I shouldn't say grasping, he has nothing. He has no narrative that he's put together that he's driving. There's, they've got these one-off, they're doing all these different policy things, but there's no overarching thing. Pierre Poilievre has been very strong. Canada is broken. That's his message. It's easy to hear. It's easy to absorb. And he's got his 4 bullet points that he drives home on that constantly.
Yes, he does.
But he drives it home. Trudeau has nothing like that. No, and he needs to get it, though. If he wants to.
Time and again to
I'm
narratives.
trying to help you. I'm giving you advice. No one's listening to
it's your hobby horse about the lack of a narrative. First of all, it's different when you're in government. And let's be honest, we've talked before.
We had Canada's economic action plan.
We worked
incredibly well.
I love those signs and doorknobs. But the reality is when you're governing, it's a bit different. No one could have predicted October 7th. You have to react to things. And again, it's getting kind of, we had all this heat around the end of March around Axe the Tax, got to meet with the premiers. And then we just kind of move on to the next thing. The only constant that we talk about is polling. The issue seems really hot, and then it's gone. It's empty calories. It's potato chip politics. But I think if you look, going back to the London caucus at the end of summer for the Liberals, they said they'd be focused on affordability and housing. They have. I've lost count of the number of announcements that Housing Minister Sean Fraser's done. I want to say that there's probably 170 communities in the province of Quebec. But also, the first 6 months of this year, housing starts were up 13%. So they are following the narrative that they said that they would go out to and do, but they also have to respond to events.
Okay, I want to get Mel in here. You know, it was interesting, though, to go back to my chat with the Prime Minister on Monday. I asked him, what do you need to do in a fourth term that you couldn't get done in the first three? And I was hoping to get him into a forward-looking thing. And he said, we're just going to continue to meet the moment, which maybe is fine, but that's continuity in a time where people are screaming for change, right? I mean, well, what's your sense of where this is?
And that's actually what I was left feeling like when I had watched that interview. It's, okay, what's next? And it doesn't sound like they figured out what's next is. What is their proposition to people? Just saying more of the same when people are not sure that the same is working for them. They're paying higher mortgages, their groceries are more expensive. The more of the same doesn't actually work. And I think, to your point, Greg, I think they've figured out what their issues are. They just can't talk about them. They haven't figured out how to speak about them in a way that's persuasive. They haven't been able to tell people, meet people where they're at, the feeling that people are feeling. And I think that's why the Conservatives are being successful. They've figured out what people are feeling and are talking about those issues in the way people are feeling it. And instead, what we heard from the Prime Minister on Monday is, well, it's worse in other places. And when people are having a hard time, that's a bit of a slap in the face.
But to be fair, they were also out highlighting, and Greg, I'll give you the last 20 seconds because you're outnumbered. We got a school lunch program that's going to start in September. They're starting to see the things they've committed to will start to be real in the next little while.
NDP.
Yeah, look, the challenge is real. If it gets to the point where it doesn't matter what you say, people aren't listening. But we were told last summer that cabinet shuffle was going to be very key. There's a lot of cabinet ministers that have been on this show that seem to trip over their own messages, to your point.